Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Small disclaimer before I start, I'm sick, so I'm sorry about that. I tried everything that I could in order to not to be sick. But if I cough and all, just bear with me. I will block the mic so it wouldn't affect you guys too much. Okay, cool. So, noted. This talk will be about open source and open choice for everyone, because open source can be adopted by anyone. And in this talk, I will give you a set of tools to help ease your decision about open source adoption, when you should do it, and give you practical tips in order to choose the right open source project for you, because there are a lot of projects out there, so we need to choose the right one for us. So a little bit about myself before we continue. I'm Hila. I'm a senior DevOps engineer and I work for Wix. I have 15 years of experience in the tech industry. I'm a DevOps culture fan. I think this is what helps companies achieve great things. I recently have joined the AWS Community Builders program. I help organize conferences in Israel, where I live, DevOps Days Tel Aviv, and Statscraft. I'm a mentor in courses and communities, and I'm a singer in a cover band. And when I'm not sick, it's even fun, more fun. Okay, so let me just enlarge the slides a bit so I don't look back. Okay, so open source is publicly available, right, and can be modified at will. Of course, you don't just push to master or main, you open a PR first. But the thing about open source is that a lot of tools that we use on our day-to-day is open source, right? Linux, Firefox, Java, React, a lot of tools that we use in our day-to-day is open source, which is awesome. In the late 90s, proprietary software was considered the standard, and making open source projects and source code, putting it as a public code was considered the best strategy for companies. And coming forward from 2020 until now, we can see that open source is becoming more and more mainstream. So let's understand what's so good about open source, even though I'm feeling like I'm preaching to the choir because it is an open source monitoring, but we will touch a bit about that. So as we all know, open source helps us build rich developer community, which is really based on knowledge, but also on communication and collaboration. I think without that, it couldn't really succeed as it is. And Manish Sharma, who's the general manager of GitHub India, he said that open source is an enabler for innovation, and companies that shift towards open source and either publish their project as open source or adopt open source projects, it helps them speed up a business and transformation because of that. Open source also boosts code quality and security because, as Linus Torvalds said, the creator of Linux and Git, he said that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So if you don't only spot the issues and the omissions and you also correct them, then the code will be much more secured and in high quality. Also, open source boosts adaptivity because the more users a project has, the more use cases, and then the code will be much more robust. It also means that if it is adaptive to various use cases, then it allows surfacing bugs much more rapidly than traditional QA processes. And it also encourages much more modularity, avoiding the one-size-fits-all kind of assumption, and then it results in greater flexibility and even lower customization costs in the long run. So another thing is that it helps with agility, right? Because a lot of projects follow modern software development cycles, which leads to rapid development cycles in general of the release of the versions, and more frequent releases because of that. We also have less bureaucracy, right? Opening a PR versus opening a support ticket for proprietary companies, we all know the difference. And there are no regularly scheduled releases. Companies with a closed source products usually release on Sundays because they don't want to affect their clients too much. But in open source, we just release the projects, and that's it. Everyone can adopt it whenever they want. So we covered, and I covered it pretty quickly, about why is it good to have open source, but I want to cover the DevOps perspective towards it, because usually it is something that is more dealt from the developer's perspective and not from the DevOps one, the infrastructure one. So let's cover how we see it. So first of all, in order to understand it, we need to understand the developer's perspective. So they say, hey, we have functionality factors to think about, and we need to understand if the library that I just found will get integrated in my code properly and what efforts are needed to do so. Maybe I need to do refactoring and stuff like that. And as opposed to that, DevOps, we have the environment factors to consider. So we need to see the project and say, hey, will it get integrated in my environment properly? And also, there are different factors like security and total and general maintenance to think about. So all peripheral things to think about other than the project itself. Another thing is that the common ground between open source and DevOps is collaboration. And because of that, it's very easy for me to go to open source because I know, let's say I assume good faith, and I know that people will help me, and I will also give an example about that in a bit. And the thing about collaboration is that, as it says here, collaboration leads to better conclusions and solutions, because when communities form around shared challenges, then the diversity of ideas that naturally emerges, then it surfaces better solutions, and we all want better solutions because it means that the environment will be in a much more healthier state because the solution fits the environment perfectly. Another thing is that we treat open source as tools, because a lot of DevOps engineers came from the background as system admins or system engineers. So the concept of integration is not strange to us. So because of that, we just see another project, we treat it like another tool, we introduce it to our tool chain, and that's basically it, and we just integrate it as a whole. So, of course, not everything is good and bright, right? We need to think about a lot of things, and there are things that could potentially harm the environment. So we are in a constant trade-off of, we want new features, we want new things that will help our developers and will help our environment to grow, but we have complexities to think about. So take, for example, Jenkins. Show me, really, raise of hands, someone that is able to upgrade Jenkins or its plugins without having any fear that it will break. Right? That's the thing. It's very scary. I remember someone I talked about, and he's like, no, it's no issues at all. And he did the update, and then it didn't work, and even the rollback didn't help. So it's terrifying. So we have trade-offs. We need to think about upgrades and what's best to our environment, but we don't want to rock the boat too much because of that. So, and there is a lot of projects out there, right? A lot of things to consider. And in the middle of everything, we have the research that we need to do to make sure that we know exactly what we introduce to our environment. Another thing that I really like to say, it's generally true for DevOps, but also for open source, is that we need to be to keep tabs and be informed of what's going on. And I will explain. So for example, I found project, an open source one, which looks okay, but version 1.0 doesn't really fit my use case perfectly, or there is a very big bug that I can't really afford myself to introduce to my environment. So let's keep tabs, and maybe version 2.0 will be great for me. The use case now fits better, the bug was fixed, and that's that. This is one example. The other example is CentOS, the operating system. CentOS reached end of life at the end of 2021. What does it mean? It means that if I didn't know about it and my systems are still running CentOS, there are no security patches released for this operating system, which puts my systems at risk. And we don't want that, especially since the environment is what is the core focus for us. So that's why we need to keep tabs and be informed what's going on. And I really like this picture because, as you can see, it says, keep moving people even though no one is there. So that's the thing. We need to keep tabs and be proactive about it without our team leader breathing down our necks and saying, hey, please check this and that. And I think it will make you a better engineer in general. Okay, so we covered the DevOps perspective. Let's understand now, when should we consider open source? Of course, these are not the only options, but I think these are the major ones. So first of all, when we have an uncommon use case, and I will give an example. In my previous job, we had a necessity of downscaling pods in Kubernetes to 0 because the application didn't need to run all the time. We didn't want to waste too much money. So at that time, we used a Google Cloud platform, and GKE only allows downscaling pods to 1 and not to 0. Then we searched for it online, and we found Keda. Keda is an open source tool, an awesome one that allows you to downscale pods to 0 based on several conditions. It is maintained. It has a roadmap, which is awesome and still maintained till this day. So this is an example of an uncommon use case. We found a solution for that, and that's it. Of course, another reason is when you have a limited budget and you can't really afford using an enterprise version or even the free version because it's not really suitable, then maybe you can find an open source tool that fits your use case, and basically that. And also another thing is that there is a thing called lower total cost of ownership. Usually, open source projects comes with a free license or a relatively free license, so it lowers the cost in general. And also, think about it this way. We need to invest time in training and maintenance integration, whether it's an open source project or a proprietary software. So might as well do it for open source if there isn't really a significant reason that prevents you from doing that. Another reason why to adopt open source is when you have insufficient in-house resources, ability-wise, like this family guy right here, or capacity-wise, that prevent you from doing that. And also there's a saying, right? Why reinvent the wheel if there is an open source tool that really fits your use case? So just use it instead of trying to reinvent the wheel and create something of your own. We can't discuss the good without discussing the bad in everything in life, really. So let's cover some of the disadvantages. So security by obscurity, this notion doesn't apply on open source because proprietary, it's a very hard language word for non-native speakers. Proprietary software companies can say that it's, since the source code is closed, hackers can't really spot issues, and that's why they are secured and open source is not. So you can agree to that, yes or no, but it's still the security by obscurity. This notion doesn't apply on open source, and we need to know about that. It is prone to abuse, and we have two examples lately to discuss. Colors NPM package, where the maintainer introduced a loop to the code, and it created a lot of issues to companies. And also Faker.js, which, if I'm not mistaken, the maintainer had a bankruptcy, and then the version that he released was actually to delete the project entirely. So it doesn't happen a lot, but since a lot of open source projects are not backed up by companies, but maintained by people like me and you, then it could happen, and we need to be aware of that. Compliance, so in its raw form, open source usually gives no warranty or official guarantee, and making it difficult to use in a business environment where compliance is a must. Of course, licenses should be reviewed, and it's not always entirely free. So we need to check that, especially if the use case is because you have a limited budget. Discontinued projects. So as I said, companies are not projects are not always backed up by companies. Sometimes they are maintained by people like me and you, and they are, they can say that I don't want to maintain this project anymore, and it's okay. It's their prerogative. So if that happens, it means one of two things. Either you maintain it if you adopted it, you will be the maintainer from now on, or you need to do a migration because of that. Support is not guaranteed, so you need to assume good faith, especially if the maintainers are individuals, because they don't owe you anything, you don't really pay them. But since open source is based on collaboration, then usually it's something that you could assume good faith, and it happens. And it happened for me with Keda. Just before it became production, there was a big issue that we saw only after a certain volume of traffic. I opened a case about it. I think it was Thursday evening or Friday, something that out of work hours. I told them, hey, people, I really need it. It's going to be production in like 2 seconds. Can you please help me? And they worked on it and released the version for me. It was awesome, and I really appreciated it. And last but not least, SaaS alternatives. It's not really the opposite of open source, but since a lot of companies shift more and more resources to the cloud, then we might see a lot of more managed services of the cloud providers being adopted versus open source solutions. So to sum things up in regards to adopting open source, there is really no right and wrong when it comes to that. It's a matter of perspective, and there are multiple factors to consider, and we need to choose what's best to your needs. And speaking of your needs, how do we choose an open source project? Because let's say you have a use case, you Googled it, and then you found 2, 3, 4 options available. How do you know which one is the best one for you? So I want to cover here several pillars, and each pillar have questions that you can ask, and while answered, you will see what really fits your use case. So let's cover each one. Popularity. So check the GitHub stars, see how much is there, of course, are there, and if the company, if the project is backed up by company, so maybe they have marketing and stuff that will affect the GitHub stars, so just bear that in mind. But if you couple it with other metrics as well, then probably it is a good metric in combination of everything. Check if the project is part of CNCF or incubator, because if so, it means that it has like a stamp that it is good to use because it follows these certain high standards that they need to be followed. Google the project alone to check for online presence, but also Google it versus other products to check for reviews, because we need to maybe something that wasn't covered in the documentation surfaced in the review and say, hey, I needed X, this didn't provide, but the other one did. And this could be a very good indication for what you need. Activity. So check the commit rate. Are the commit rate daily, weekly, monthly? How many issues are there? How many releases are there? Is the project maintained by one maintainer or more? Is the project have sponsors, aka companies that believe in the future of the project and invest money in it to make sure it is successful and being maintained? So all of these questions is meant for you to understand that if you, for example, you have a heavy use case and you need new features, or you need bug fixes, how long should you need to wait in order to get those? So if you have heavy use case, you probably can't really afford yourself waiting too much, and the activity metrics are good for you to understand that. Security. So security is usually, at least in my experience, something that is more relevant to libraries that you integrate in your code as versus to projects that are standalone in the environment, because there isn't really a supply chain here. It's not really that internal, but still, I believe that security is something that needs to be considered every time that you do anything in production. So just make sure that the project that you're dealing with doesn't have any known vulnerabilities. And if there are any supply chain considerations, make sure you make them, because we need to take care of security always. Readiness. So is the project declared as production ready? CADA that I mentioned before, 3 times the charm. It is production ready, which is awesome for me to know as the maintainer of the production environment. Are the current features enough to sustain usage? And is my use case covered fully in the current state? And if not, am I okay with it? Because if not, hey, let's keep tabs, and maybe the next version will be much more suitable for my use case. Documentation. So documentation, I like to call it the gateway to the project. Why? Because you don't know anything about this project and you need to know something, right? You need to know how to integrate and known issues and explanations about features. So if the documentation is rich and covers most of these aspects, then it will help you not only with the integration of the tool, but also with your day-to-day with it, and to really understand if this project is good for you or not. Because if the features are well explained, then you know that it covers your use case or not. So documentation is very important in that aspect. Ecosystem. I believe that ecosystem is probably one of the biggest, or the biggest metric to evaluate open source, because this is what helps you in your day-to-day, and I will explain. In one of my previous companies, I used Rundeck as the CI tool, and at that time, documentation wasn't great, and the ecosystem was very small. So once I had a need to enhance some capabilities or create new flows, it was very hard to do, because I didn't have anyone to really communicate and consult with. Documentation wasn't really great to check for references, so it was very hard to maintain day to day. As opposed to that, in other company that I worked for, I use Jenkins as the CI tool. You can say a lot of things about Jenkins, but it has a very large ecosystem. So it has even, a Slack workspace of its own. So people are using it, and you can consult with them. But the thing about ecosystem is not only people to consult with, but also people that open issues and discuss it online, so you have like online presence of this tool. And also the fact that the ecosystem is very large, it means that probably you can assume that a lot of use cases are covered, since, as I said before, more users using it, then more use cases are covered, so it will be much more robust to use and probably will fit your use case. So ecosystem is very important in the day-to-day. Ease of use. So do a POC, see how well the project gets integrated in your environment. Also check the ratio between the amount of time to implement until integration is finally done. And also check the issues on GitHub. If the issues are about how do I do X and not about features, then it probably means that the project is not that easy to use. And if you have like a shortage of staff, and you don't really have resources to allocate for day-to-day maintenance, then it's very important to understand if it's easy to use or not. And last but not least, roadmap. So both check if the project is defined as an open source, or is the plan to go towards monetization, because some projects are saying that, hey, yeah, we know that we're going towards monetization, which means that the source code will become closed, so we need to be aware of that. And also features planning. If the project is very, very well thought of, very well maintained, then it means that there's a feature to it, they know what they're planning to do, and as I mentioned before, it allows us to keep tabs, and maybe you will see that version 1 is not really what we need, but version 2 is exactly what we need, and we can wait until integration for this version to come out. So to sum all of these questions here, basically how to choose an open source project, you need to ask the general questions to cover the basics and understand if the project is in a ready enough state in general, but also ask the tailored specific questions to cover your use case and your pain points. So for example, if you have a heavy use case, then you should put the emphasis and like weights of the metrics on documentation and ecosystem. But if you have no capacity for maintenance, then you should focus on readiness and ease of use metrics. Do a POC, see how well it gets integrated in your environment, and rely on your research, right? Ecosystem to the rescue, also engage in GitHub, open issues, and contribute to the project success and eventually your success. And I want to finish and wrap up this session with some notes about how to contribute to open source without writing a single line of code, because you don't know how to do it. Not all of us are developers, or because you don't have the time to do it. So first of all, open issues. It will help making the project more robust and more suitable for a lot of use cases. Modify documentation. As I showed you before, it is a metric that I think is worth considering when while you consider whether to adopt open source project or not. So, and it is a skill. So if you have the skill of documentation, please leverage it. I will thank you. Everyone will thank you. Share your use case. I've written a blog post about a script server, which is an open source tool to make Terraform and Ansible and any other scripts accessible through a UI with permissions. So it's good because I don't want to let people go to servers and do whatever they want. That way they can do only what they needed and with permissions set. So that's good. And I shared about it because people can, read it, and maybe you will see that this tool is something that they need as well. So if you have use cases, you can share them online. It will be beneficial for everyone. In general, share tools that you found with colleagues and techie friends. Sponsorships. So for projects that are maintained by individuals, you should really understand that sponsorship and money is very important to them. And sometimes it will make or break the day-to-day maintenance of that project. So if you can contribute, or you can convince your company to contribute to the projects that at least you use in the company itself, then it will be awesome. Hold an open source mindset. So if I have a use case, I could go to a proprietary software and that's it, or I can Google open source projects and go towards this angle. And then if I do it and it's successful, people see that I integrated tools and it works and everything is great, then maybe other people will benefit from this state of mind and will do that as well. And last but not least, share and spread the word on open source at conferences like I'm doing just now. So I think I'm out of time, right? Okay, so this is something we can discuss outside, but something about sharing open source initiative throughout companies. But that's it. I really hope that you enjoyed this session. I'm sorry about the coughing. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hila. Press the button once so. Here we go. Okay, thanks very much, Hila, for all those interesting takes towards OSS adoption for companies. I personally found it very interesting. Are there any questions? No questions. Actually, I got a question.
Sure.
You talked about considerations regarding supply chains and how integrating open source libraries should be considered. What about projects that you do not integrate into your code base, but which might be involved into delivering your software, like, for example, Tecton as a CI/CD tool, or you mentioned Jenkins. Are there additional considerations you should take or you do take when you think about adopting such a project?
So when, for example, when we wanted to adopt a SCI tool, then since the Jenkins ecosystem is very, very large and it has a lot of use cases, then we saw an opportunity to utilize Jenkins for that. So all the considerations that I that I shown here is basically treating anything that we need to introduce to our environment. So whether it is a third party that we integrate, whether it's just a tool that we use once, but everything that we need to use, I also follow these considerations, and it usually covers everything that I need to do. Okay, thank you very much. No additional questions still? Then there's nothing left to do for me, but to thank you again for coming here, delivering your talk. A little present for you. Yay. And have a nice conference. Thank you. Thank you so much, guys. Yourself